Well, there's no one better to start off our course than Revd Dr John Polkinghorne. He's just about the best known person in the whole field of science and religion in the world, I think, and a pioneer in many, many ways. His career in physics culminated with him being a professor of mathematical physics here in Cambridge, elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, and he gave that up to train for ordination in the Church of England. Subsequently did a couple of jobs in parishes, and then, academia had to have him back, and he became Dean of Trinity Hall and subsequently President of Queen's College. He has written numerous books about science and religion, and we've got quite a selection on the bookstall. He's going to talk to us tonight about the interaction between science and theology.
John Hedley Brooke, who was the first professor of science and theology at Oxford, and is of course a distinguished historian of science and religion, and wrote a very fine book tracing the history of the interaction between science and religion from about the middle of the 17th century to the end of the 19th century. I'm sure some of you will know that book. In that book, one of his main messages is there is no simple, single way of understanding the form of the interaction between science and religion. And I think that's true. But what I'm going to try and do in this talk is to explore various models for that interaction, some of which I will suggest are helpful, some of which I shall suggest are not helpful. And no doubt in any particular situation, more than one model will be in action, and if you will need a judicious mixture between the two, a mixture which will no doubt also change with changing historical circumstances. So that's the sort of general picture. Now, perhaps the most famous classification for models for the interaction between science and religion was given by Ian Barber, the sort of doyen of the science and religion world, and it's given in his given lectures. And he produced a fourfold typology of the interaction. And the first of the types is the model of conflict. Shall I carry on?
Yes.
Okay, right. This is the model of conflict. That's the picture, of course, that science and religion are at war with each other, and one side is going to win the war. Sometimes when people hear that I'm both a scientist and a Christian, they give me a funny look, as if I'd said to them, I'm a vegetarian butcher. Because they think that you really ought to decide which side you're going to be on in this great warfare, this great confrontation. Now, of course, I think that's a mistake. I certainly don't think that either science or religion tells you the whole story. Science clearly doesn't tell you the whole story. It has purchased its very great success by, in fact, the modesty of its ambition. It doesn't seek to ask and answer every question about the world. Essentially, it's answering the question of the process of the world, how things happen. It doesn't consider every kind of human encounter with reality. Science essentially treats reality as an object, something that is at your disposal to kick around, to pull apart, and investigate it as you wish. I was a theoretical physicist, but I would gladly admit that during my 25 years in particle physics, the subject was largely driven by the experimental discoveries of our colleagues. That's a marvelous secret weapon for science to have. But we all know that there's a great swathe of human experience where we encounter reality not as an it, but if you like, as a thou, a personal rather than impersonal dimension of reality. And when we move into that realm, whether it's the realm of relationships between ourselves or relationships with the transpersonal reality of God, then testing has to give way to trusting. If I'm always setting little traps to see if you're my friend, I shall quite quickly, of course, destroy the possibility of friendship between us. So science doesn't have the universal method, and it doesn't tell you everything. If you were to ask a scientist, as a scientist, to tell you all that he or she could about music, I guess what they would say would be music, our experience of music is neural response, things firing off inside our brains, to the impact of sound waves on the eardrum. And of course that's obviously true in this way. and it's worth knowing in this way, but it hardly encapsulates the whole mystery of music, does it? There's much more to say about music simply than that. This amazing power that music has through a temporal succession of packets of sound to speak to us, and to speak to us truly, I believe, of a timeless realm of beauty that we encounter in that sort of way. So science can't tell us the whole story, and of course equally religion can't tell us the whole story. It's a very bad mistake. It's a mistake on the whole we've learned not to make, not completely, all of us learned not to make it, but not to try and use religious arguments to answer scientific questions. We have every reason to suppose scientifically posable questions receive scientifically stateable answers, even if there are many questions which are both interesting and necessary to ask which are not scientific. And it is not the role of theology to step in and tell the scientists what they have to think in their domain. Nevertheless, there is this conflict thesis. It's quite a popular thesis out there. It's very strongly encouraged, I think, by the tone of a great deal of the treatment of science-religion issues in the media. Media like confrontation. So they like to have one side shouting yes, the other side shouting no. Of course, if they come to blows, that would be a really good piece of television. So I think that there is a lot of distortion going on. And of course, there are fundamentalists on both sides of the issue who really do proclaim the invincible supremacy of their own particular discipline. The religious fundamentalists tend to be biblical literalists who believe that all the answers to scientific questions are to be found in the pages of the Bible. And of course the irony of that creationist position, using creationist in that curious North American sense. I'm not a creationist, I believe the world is God's creation, but I'm certainly not a creationist in the North American sense of an unthinking, flat-footed biblical literalism. And the irony is, of course, that people who treat Genesis 1, for example, as if it were a divinely guaranteed textbook, kindly given to us to save us the trouble of actually doing science, they are actually abusing Scripture. Because when you read something, out of respect to what you read, one of the first things you have to do is to establish the genre of what you're reading. And the Bible is not a book, of course. The Bible is a library. It has all different kinds of writing in it. It has poetry, it has prose, it has stories, it has history, and so on and so on. And if you're going to understand what you're reading, you have to figure out what kind of literature you're reading. If you were to pick up Robert Burns and read My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, and you didn't recognize it was poetry, and you would say, well, gracious me, this girlfriend has leaves and prickles, then you would certainly be making a bad mistake. And people who think that Genesis 1 is the account of a hectic 6 days of divine activity are in fact abusing the Scripture that they wish to respect. So there are the fundamentalists on that side, and of course there are the fundamentalists on the anti-religious side, of whom I suppose the outstanding example is Richard Dawkins, who really is absolutely a fundamentalist. I mean, The God Delusion is really a thoroughly bad book. And I haven't read a serious review of it, whether it's written by Marxist Terry Eagleton or by a more religiously inclined person, which hasn't essentially said that. It's a book that contains no argument in it. It is full of assertion, it is full of polemic, it's extraordinarily distorted in the way it presents the case. It's a debating book rather than a truth-seeking book. So that Dawkins can spend many, many pages talking about the terrible things that religious people have done. And of course that is part of the story, and we have to acknowledge that and be penitent and regretful for that, the history of crusades and inquisitions. But then, to just mention Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot in passing is an extremely dishonest thing to do. Terrible things have happened in human history, caused both by religious people and by non-religious people. It's a human problem rather than a religious problem in the world. So I think that we can say a plague on both our houses as far as those are concerned, and that we shouldn't take seriously the model of there is a necessary conflict between science and religion. I don't think for a minute that there is, even if there may be the appearance of a pseudo-conflict from time to time. Okay, if that's the case, and if science is asking one set of questions and answering those questions, and religion is asking another set of questions and answering those questions, maybe the answer is not conflict, but independence. And this is, of course, the stance that's celebrated Stephen Jay Gould took in his book Rock of Ages, where he speaks about non-overlapping magisteria. I mean, here's science, it gets on with its job. Here's religion, if you like that sort of thing, it gets on with its job. And they really haven't anything to say to each other. They just completely miss each other. That's quite a popular attitude to take among scientists who don't want to be totally dismissive of religion, who are perhaps respectful, for example, of the cultural or social achievements of religion, but who don't want to take religion very seriously either. It's the official stance of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, which issued a paper about this some years ago. And at first sight it might seem attractive, but again I don't think it works. The reason it doesn't work is that in fact it's perfectly clear that there is some form of interaction between science and religion. I mean, this is the great Darwin year. Who could stand up and pretend that theological insight into the nature of creation has not been affected by Darwin's great discovery of evolution and natural selection? The tone of theological discourse about creation, for example, an emphasis upon the notion of creation as a continuous creation, rather than an initiating sudden one-off event, that has certainly been strengthened and encouraged, much to the benefit of theology, in my opinion, through taking seriously the evolving character of the world in which we live. It's true that science and religion are asking different questions about the world, how and why, if you like, putting it slightly crudely, but I think not completely misleading. How is process? Why is things like meaning and value and purpose, things of that nature. Of course, these are different questions, and we're perfectly familiar with the fact that we can ask and answer both those sets of questions about the same event. The kettle is boiling because burning gas heats the water. The kettle is boiling because I want to make a cup of tea. And would you like to have one? I don't have to choose between those two answers. And in fact, if I'm truly to understand the mysterious event of the boiling kettle, I should have to give both of those answers to explain what's going on. So they're different questions and they have different answers, but the answers must somehow be consonantly related to each other. If I were to say to you, my purpose is to make a cup of tea, and I put the kettle in the refrigerator, you would become suspicious of the genuineness of my intention, because the answer of purpose that I'm giving doesn't fit in with the answer of process that I've said to do. So there is this search for consonance between science and religion, and that is, I think, essentially the domain in which the fruitful interaction takes place between the two. They are certainly not totally unrelated to each other. I've sometimes read, though, other people won't say this, I've sometimes read that when Michael Faraday, of course, was a very great scientist and also a deeply religious person, I've sometimes read that people said that when he went into his laboratory, he forgot about God, and when he came out of his laboratory, he forgot about his science. I don't think, and I certainly hope, that isn't true of Faraday. We have to live integrated lives. I'm a passionate believer myself in the unity of knowledge, and I want to add together and see the mutual compatibility and mutual degree of fruitfulness in the exchange between the two. Let me give you an example of the fruitfulness of what science has to offer to religion. And interestingly enough, I think my best example I can think of really comes from that great discovery of 150 years ago. It comes from evolutionary biology. It is, of course, as I'm sure you all know, absolutely historically untrue to suggest that when Darwin published The Origin of Species, all the scientific people shouted yes, 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 and all the religious people, including, of course, particularly the obscurantist clergy, shouted no, no, no. There were difficulties and uncertainties on both sides in relation to it. Difficulties on the scientific side, because people didn't understand, and Darwin himself admittedly didn't understand, where those small differences come from between one generation and the next, on which the shifting effects of natural selection have to act. It was only when genetics was discovered, in fact, of course, only a few years after the publication of The Origin, but by Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk, but of course unrecognised in the world of science because he published it in some obscure obscure Middle European journals. And then genetics was rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century, and the fruitful synthesis between evolutionary insight and genetic insight, which produced neo-Darwinism, came into being. Of course, it's been so convincing and helpful and explanatory in relation to the history of life. So there were doubts on the scientific side, and on the religious side, I'm sure you know, there were people who from the start welcomed the insights that Darwin was able to provide. One of those was Charles Kingsley, the novelist, Cambridge man, of course, and as Darwin himself was, come to think of it. And they were good friends, and they corresponded with each other and respected each other. And about the time of the publication of The Origin, Kingsley coined the phrase, in a letter to Darwin, I believe, which I think perfectly encapsulates the theological way to think about an evolving world. What Kingsley said was, no doubt, the Creator could have snapped the divine fingers and brought it into being a ready-made world. But Darwin had shown that God had done something cleverer than that. But God had brought into being a creation so endowed with potentiality that creatures could be allowed to be themselves and to make themselves. The evolutionary process is the process by which creatures make themselves. And I think that's a very deep and satisfying insight. And from a theological point of view, if one may presume to make the judgment, an evolving world of that kind is a better world than a ready-made world would be. Because the God of Christian theology is the God of love, and the gift of love is always the gift of some due form of independence to the objects of love. And therefore, the Christian God cannot be the sort of cosmic tyrant. That God's creation cannot be just a divine puppet theatre in which God pulls every string. There must be some freedom and openness to creatures to be themselves and to make themselves in that world. So that's the evolving world is a great good in that respect. It's a great good, but it has also an inescapable shadow side to it. Because though the explorations of contingency, of chance, if you like to use that word, will bring to birth astonishing new fruitfulness, they will also, of course, have their ragged edges and blind alleys. There is an inescapable cost to the goodness of an evolving world. Genetic mutation, which is the engine, of course, which is driven by biological evolution, will not only produce, when it takes place in germ cells, not only produce new forms of life, when it takes place in somatic cells, it will produce, in some cases, malignancy. Now, the fact that there is cancer in the world is clearly an anguishing fact about the world. And I don't want to suggest there's some simple one-line argument that removes it. Not at all. But it is at least helpful, I think, to theologies. It wrestles with what is surely its greatest problem, the problem of evil and suffering, disease and disaster in the world that claim to be the creation of a good and powerful God, in showing that the existence, at least for some of these terrible things, is not gratuitous. Not something that a God who is a bit more competent or a bit less callous could easily have eliminated. It's the necessary cost of a world, in this case, in which creatures make themselves. We all tend to think that if we'd been in charge of creation, we would have done it better. We would have kept all the nice things, the sunsets, the flowers, got rid of all the nasty things, the disease and disaster. But the more we understand through science how the world works, the more we see how entangled these things are. It's a package deal. You can't tear them apart. Here are the good things, keep those. Here are the bad things, throw them away. Think about genetic mutation again. New life, malignancy. And that's a little bit of a help, I think, as theology wrestles with its problem of evil and suffering. So that's an example of the sort of fruitful exchange between science and religion. In the opposite direction, well, the gift that theology can give to science is not to, as I said already, not to answer science's questions for it, but to take science's understanding and set it within a broader and deeper context of intelligibility. I'm a physicist, and one of the most striking things from the physicist's point of view about the world in which we live is its deep intelligibility. The fact that we can penetrate the secrets of the subatomic world. The fact that we can understand quantum physics. I mean, the quantum world, as you all know, is totally different from the world of every day, cloudy and fitful, while the world of every day appears to be, on the whole, clear and reliable. Well, we can understand that world despite its strangeness, and we can understand it by using concepts that are themselves highly counterintuitive. Quantum theory is a very counterintuitive subject, but we've learned how to think about it in that sort of way. The world is rationally transparent to our inquiry. Not only is it rationally transparent, but it also turns out it's rationally beautiful. Because the fundamental laws of physics are found always to be expressed in mathematically beautiful equations. Most of you probably know about mathematical beauty. It's something like economy and elegance and things like that. And it's a property that mathematicians value and can recognize and can agree about. So it is, I think, a real property. And we've found time and again that the theories that really fit the world have this property of mathematical beauty. Our search for beautiful equations isn't just an aesthetic indulgence, it's an actual technique of discovery. Now, is that just our luck? Bit of good luck, you chaps are good at maths? I think it would be intolerably lazy just to shrug one's shoulders and say, gee, that's the way it happens to be. That's it. Science itself, of course, exploits the intelligibility of the world, exploits its wonderful order, but it doesn't explain where that comes from. Now, religious belief makes that intelligible, because a world which is shot through with order in this sort of way is a world, you might say, shot through with science of mind and its structure. And for a religious believer, it is the capital M mind of the Creator, indeed, that lies behind the wonderful order of the world. So that would be an example of a gift that religious belief gives to science, not to, as I say, to answer science's questions for it, but to make intelligible what otherwise has to be, which otherwise it seems to be both highly significant, but from a purely scientific point of view, would have to be treated as simply as happy, accidental, brute fact. So in fact, science and religion are not totally distinct from each other. There is a trade across the boundary between the two. I like very often to say that I'm two-eyed. I look at the world with the eye of science, I look at the world with the eye of religion, and with my binocular vision in that way, I can see further and deeper than I could with either eye on its own. And that's why I've talked about conflict, I've talked about independence. That's why Ian Barber added to that two further categories, which were categories of dialogue, conversation between the two, and even a category of integration. Now, the dialogue I've just given an example of. It is essentially, I think, a search for consonance between the perspectives of science and the perspectives of religion, so that those perspectives fit together in a way that is comfortable and illuminating. Integration is, I think, a much more problematic problematic stance to go for. Ian has sort of flirted with that, but not wholly committed to it. So he says somewhere that he likes his own approach as a mixture of dialogue and assimilation. The danger of assimilation, I think, is that very often, many attempted forms of assimilation, science turns out to be the dominant partner, and it becomes a sort of takeover bit, so that religion is forced to conform itself to some preconceived structure that arises from the scientific side. Ian Barber, as I'm sure you know, has been very much influenced in all his theological thinking by process theology. And process thinking, the process thinking of Alfred North Whitehead, does present an attempted integration between scientific insight and theological insight. And I think it's unsatisfactory. I think, I something I'm going to say is people tell me I'm a process theologian, though I don't know it, but I always decline the honour that's offered to me, because I myself don't think that the process thinking gets it right. First of all, it doesn't actually fit very well the process of metaphysics. You know, Whitehead's key idea was that the basic unit is an event, an actual occasion, as he called it. So that instead of talking about beings and things like that, we talk about concatenations, chains of events, of actual occasions, that sort of way. And I think that metaphysic, that's rather punctuated metaphysics of a chain of events, doesn't actually fit very well onto the physics of the world. Whitehead was in London until about 1924, I think, and he was very much in touch with the scientific world in this country. Then he went to Harvard in 1924. In those days, Harvard was pretty isolated from the scientific world, and I think Whitehead never really took on the developments of modern quantum theory, which of course took place in the anni mirabiles of 1924, 25, 26. And I don't think that punctuated, event-dominated metaphysics fits onto the rather subtle character of quantum physics. Of course, there are discontinuous events in quantum theory, acts of measurement. There's also a tremendous amount of continuous development in quantum theory. The Schrödinger equation is a perfectly mathematically well-behaved differential equation. Its solutions, the wave function solutions, are perfectly continuous. It's only a measurement of the mysterious and still contentious notion of the collapse of the wave packet onto a particular observed result of the measurement that discontinuity comes in. So I don't think that Whitehead's metaphysics fits very well onto what we know about physics. And though physics doesn't determine metaphysics, it certainly constrains it. And also I don't think that Whitehead's process theology is an adequate theology. The God of process thought is, in that powerful phrase of Whitehead's, a fellow sufferer who understands, but that God is really at the margins of occurrence, seeking to move the world simply by influence, by the lure, very typical Whiteheadian word, the lure, seeking to draw actual events, actual occasions in a desirable direction. But what actually happens, the concrescence phrase in the jargon of the subject, is the choice. You can't talk about process metaphysics without getting very sort of anthropomorphic in the way you use terms you use. I mean, Whitehead wasn't naively anthropomorphic, of course, by any manner of means, but it has this curious panpsychism built into it, and the God of process theology is a pleader, seeking to lure creation in the right direction, but still having to operate at the margins of actual occurrence. And I think that's just too weak a conception of the nature of God. Certainly from a Christian point of view, the God of process theology could hardly be the God who raised our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead. So I don't buy that particular account. So I've talked about it, but nevertheless I think there is this interaction between science and religion. I prefer consonance consonance and dialogue to integration, and they have in common, of course, what makes them cousinly related to each other is that they have in common the search for truth to be attained through motivated belief. That's true of both science, and I believe it's also true of religion. Of course, the motivations are different because they're different kinds of beliefs the one's looking for, but they both have this desire in the search for truth. People sometimes say, but a lot of people don't see that, particularly about religion. A lot of people say that, okay, science is concerned with fact, and religion is concerned with opinion. I might respect you for your opinion, you're entitled to your opinion, all that sort of thing. You shouldn't take it as seriously. It ain't good old solid scientific fact. That's often put over. And I think it's a mistaken thing to say, but I think it involves actually two mistakes. It involves a mistake about science and a mistake about religion. The mistake about science is that there are no interesting scientific facts that are not already interpreted facts. We might all be sitting in the laboratory and looking at some piece of apparatus, and we might all be able to agree that the pointer on the scale moved up to 3.7 or whatever it might be, but so what? Until I know what that apparatus is actually measuring, that fact has no significance for me. And I shan't know what the apparatus is measuring without theoretical opinion telling me how that piece of apparatus is going to work. So in science there is a circular interchange between experimental experience, experimental fact if you like, and theoretical opinion. Experiments constrain theories, but theories interpret experiments. There is a sort of hermeneutic circle, as people like to say. I think there's a very, very strong reason from the success of science of believing that circle to be a benign circularity rather than a vicious circularity. But it's there. So science is a subtle activity. It's not unproblematically objective in that sort of fact way. simple fact way. My favourite philosopher of science is Michael Polanyi, who of course was a very distinguished physical chemist before he turned to philosophy, so he knew science thoroughly from the inside. And in his great book, Personal Knowledge, he says in the preface, and he's talking about science, remember, he says, "I'm writing this book to show how I may commit myself to what I believe to be true, knowing that it might be false." And that, I think, is the human condition. I don't think we have absolutely certain knowledge. I mean, Kurt Gödel showed us that even in mathematics, an axiomatized system cannot prove its own consistency. So there's a certain act of faith involved in mathematics, a pretty easy act of faith for most of us, I think. Not too many people lie awake at night worrying about the consistency of arithmetic. But nevertheless, there is a problem there. And so the science is a subtle activity. We can attain well-motivated beliefs to which it is reasonable, it is rational to commit ourselves. Commitment is a very important idea in Polanyi's thinking. That's true in science. And I think much the same is true on the religious side. A lot of my friends in the scientific world, who are not religious believers, are both wistful and wary about religion. They can see that science doesn't tell you the answer to everything. They want a broader and a deeper view of reality than science can provide. And they also perceive that a religious point of view would offer such a broader and deeper view. But they're wary of religion. And they're wary of religion because their picture of religion is that it's based on faith. And their picture of faith is you shut your eyes, you grit your teeth, you do 6 impossible things before breakfast. Some unquestionable authority tells you that's what you have to do. And of course they don't want to commit intellectual suicide. Neither do I, and neither do you. So what I'm always trying to do when I get the chance to talk to my friends about this is to persuade them that I have motivations, my religious beliefs, just as I have motivations, my scientific beliefs. They're different kinds of motivations because they're different kinds of beliefs. But for me, they're strong enough for me to commit my life to their truth. Now, my friends may not share that belief in the adequacy of those motivations. That's a matter for them to judge. But they should at least acknowledge that they're there. Something like Richard Dawkins, who presents religious belief as unthinking, irrational, fideistic assertion, is once again caricaturing what's involved in religion. And it's amazingly patronizing at times, referring to some of us who are both serious scientists and religious believers. So, finding the truth is a delicate matter. Most scientists are, philosophically, whether they know it or not, some do and some don't, are philosophically, I think, what you would call critical realists. By that, I mean they believe that through our scientific investigations of the world, we are actually finding about what the world is actually, in some respects, the world is actually like. In fact, I can't see why anyone would endure all the labour and frustration and weary routine involved in scientific research unless one felt, at the end of the day, one was learning a little bit more about what the world is like. So we are realists in that sense, almost all of us. We don't think it's some sort of confabulation. I mean, nature resists our expectations. We approach nature with some particular understanding in mind, and then we find that nature behaves in a totally different way, a way that may seem to us totally irrational. If you've been around in 1899, and I don't suppose anybody here was, been around in 1899, and somebody has said to you, you know, sometimes something can behave like a wave, spread out flappy thing, and sometimes it can behave like a particle, a little bullet. You said absolute nonsense. How could anything behave in that oxymoronic sort of way? But of course, as we all know, that's how light behaves. And when we found out that's how light behaves, eventually, through quantum field theory, we came to understand how it was able to do this remarkable trick of sometimes looking wave-like, sometimes looking particle-like. We wouldn't have been driven to that if it hadn't been for the stubborn nudge of nature pushing us in that direction. There is the whole field of doing science is the field of discovery and not confabulation. I think the similar thing is true in religion's encounter. It's that's what revelation means, really. It means disclosure events which drive us to an understanding of God or God's ways, which we would not have come to if that hadn't been given to us, or we haven't become the heirs of those who had that sort of insight. Critical realism is, it seems to me, and this is a very, very common feeling among the scientists, theologians, that critical realism is the way to think both about the religious search for truth and about the scientific search for truth. Okay, well that's the Barber scheme. That's the Barber scheme of conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. But when I came to think a bit more about these things a few years ago, I came to the conclusion that that was a valuable and useful set of models. It left a lot of things unsaid and unaddressed. And so in the book, Elvin Morris charged from the bookstall over there, this is called Science and the Trinity. The first chapter is a rediscussion of how to think about the dialogue between science and religion. I'm simply trying in that chapter to discuss the dialogue stroke assimilation. I'm not talking about conflict, I'm not talking about independence. I'm talking about what sort of interaction there might be involved in a conversation between science and religion, the way I've been trying to outline. And I felt it was very important to classify the possible forms of dialogue in terms of the content that they might be addressing. The Barber classification is not in a sense methodological, but it's very important, I think, to bear in mind the content. When I started thinking about that, I came to believe that to perceive and to believe that there were, broadly speaking, 4 different kinds of dialogue, depending upon the degree of theological content that participants in the dialogue were prepared to acknowledge and engage with. So let me just run through those classifications. The first starts as one that I classified as deistic. That's the attitude to dialogue, actually quite common among physicists, which is a sort of expresses a sort of cosmic religiosity. I've referred earlier this evening to the deep intelligibility of the world. That has induced in many physicists a sort of cosmic religiosity, the feeling that there is some sort of intelligence behind the wonderful order of the world. Einstein was a very outstanding example of that kind of religiosity. You may remember he once said that when he made his great discoveries of general relativity, he felt like a child in the presence of the elders. He had written down these beautiful equations, but he felt that they had been there beforehand, and that he was recapitulating something that had come from a deeper source. Einstein liked, as you know, liked to talk about God. He was a great coiner of one-liners. He was absolutely emphatic that he didn't believe in the personal God of the Jews or Christians. He rejected his Jewish heritage in that respect. But he had this cosmic religiosity. And in our day, I suppose, Paul Davies is an interesting example of a writer who takes this point of view. Paul discusses things like intelligibility of the world, cosmic fine-tuning, the coming to be of consciousness in the course of cosmic history, things of this nature. And he says these things are significant, and we should take them seriously, and that there is some sort of mind or intelligence that lies behind it. So that in his early book on science and religion, called God and the New Physics, somewhere other in that book he says, I believe that physics offers a surer way to God than religion, meaning that this intelligibility is the best argument you can find for some belief of some sort of divine intelligence or divine-like intelligence behind the order of the world. He says it may seem bizarre to say that, and I think it is bizarre to say that, and I think that it gives you actually a very inadequate view of God. I mean, at the very best, it gives you a picture of God as something like the great mathematician, and I think there's more to be found out about God than simply that. And Paul says, quite frankly, in the same paragraph, that he sees no sign of the personal God of the Jews and Christians. And of course he doesn't. He's looking in the wrong sphere of experience. If you just look at the general experience of the world, you'll only get a generalized view of God. The God of deism, the God who has set the world in being with a given order and then is just standing back to watch it happen. If you're going to investigate the possibility of finding signs and evidence of a personal God, you'll have to take the risk of engaging in some form of personal encounter. with that reality, or with the signs of that reality, which is a much more dangerous thing to do than thinking about the intelligibility of the world. So I think from the theistic point of view, it's a step in the right direction, but it's a pretty small step, and I don't think it carries the conversation very much further. Now, the next sort of form of content that is one that I labelled theistic, and my example of that is in fact Ian Barber. I mean, Ian, a good friend of mine, and I greatly respect him. He's a pioneer in our field, and he obviously writes from a Christian viewpoint, but he is pretty reserved about a good many what I would see as being central Christian doctrines. So though though he takes scripture, bits of scripture seriously, he's pretty selective in what he chooses there, and I think his process thinking constrains him really. I would suggest that the process picture of God is not a wholly adequate picture of God. For example, Ian quite often refers to the cross of Christ, and he sees it as a moving image of sacrificial suffering, and writes powerfully about that. He virtually never writes about the resurrection, one way or the other. And there's a sort of reserve there, and I think myself that's not enough. Again, it's a further step in the right direction, but I myself, because I'm a pretty orthodox, conventional, you might almost say, Nicene thinking Christian, I believe that things like the resurrection are absolutely central. And one of the things that attracts me about Christian belief is, to some extent, its complexity. A scientist doesn't expect a deep theory. It may have a certain simplicity and unity about it, but a scientist doesn't expect a deep theory to be undemanding. He doesn't expect it to be counterintuitive. If science has taught us anything, I'm saying this really just now, but I didn't use these words, science has taught us anything about the world, it is surprising. We must expect our thought to be moulded by the impact of reality in unexpected ways, and that means, that encourages me in the thought that there's more to a Christian belief than Ian, though he is clearly taking a stand within the Christian community, that Ian has actually been able to articulate in his writing. So we've got deism, we've got theism. The next category I've called revisionary, and my example there is my dear friend and former colleague, the late Arthur Peacock. I have great respect for Arthur. We knew each other very well, and he's been a very important figure in the science and theology world, not least, of course, in his very positive thinking about evolutionary biology and so on. But there is a sort of rhetoric Arthur takes Christian belief much more seriously, or much more explicitly, perhaps I should say, than Ian Barber does. He does write quite a lot about the resurrection. He spends quite a lot of time writing about Scripture and interpreting Scripture, and so on, and so on. But nevertheless, there is a sort of rhetoric, and it grew a stronger rhetoric in Arthur as he grew older, that somehow or other there has to be also some sort of revision, and in a rather radical sort of way, that the scientific worldview is going to force upon us a fairly root and branch reconsideration of traditional mainline Orthodox Christian thinking. Although I think was a little bit undecided about that really. Sometimes he's more on the traditional side, sometimes more on the revisionist side. But he did have that inclination from time to time. Like Ian Barber, he tended to for example, to express his understanding of Christology in functional terms. Jesus is the window into God. Jesus is the great exemplar. Jesus is the new emergent. Both Ian Barber and Arthur Peacock use a new emergent in the evolutionary process of humanity. I don't think that's an idea that makes sense at all. Are we to suppose that as evolutionary process progresses, more and more people will be raised from the dead 3 days after their death? I don't think so. There is a uniqueness, a unique significance, and I think that I want myself an ontological Christology, and not just a functional Christology. Jesus is, of course, in one sense, the great example. But what we need is not just an example. We don't need just information. What we need is empowering to follow the example and make use of that information about the divine purpose. And that's where I think the salvific side of our Christian experience comes in. And it seems to me, for that, you need that Jesus is a being in whom, of course, the true life of humanity is present. So he is one of us, and we have a solidarity with him, and he has a solidarity with us. But also the life of God is there, which is the power, the only ultimate power that can transform our lives in that sort of way. So revisionary thinking is again, several steps in the right direction, but I don't think it's quite right. So I want a fourth category, which is a category that I apply to myself, and which I call developmental. And of course, I think that there are new understandings, and of course, I've already said that for example, the way we think about traditional Christian doctrines, like, say, the doctrine of creation, is certainly influenced, and rightly influenced, by contemporary or recent discoveries in science. Evolutionary thinking has certainly changed the form of our discourse in that sort of way. So I do want to see, I'm not a traditionalist in the sense that I think that everything was settled in New Testament times or in Chalcedon in 451 or whatever. I think there is an unfolding history of theological understanding and exploration. And if you believe in the Holy Spirit, by the way, I think that's what you'd expect it to be. I mean, in the discourses in John's Gospel, Jesus says the Spirit will lead us into more truth than Jesus could give to the apostles at that time. So I want a developing view, but I want that as to see that as a development which is in some sort of continuous, consonant relationship with the insights of the past. You see, one of the big contrasts between science and theology is, of course, that science is a very cumulative, linear sort of subject. Any PhD physicist today knows much, much more about the universe than Isaac Newton ever knew. Not by being cleverer than that great genius, but simply by living 300 years later. And science is what we like to call a synchronic subject. That's to say, contemporary understanding, often incorporated in textbooks, is all that you need. I've never read the Principia or even Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism, but all those insights that are of lasting value from those great men are incorporated in the current understanding. But there are many, many forms of human encounter with reality which don't have that linear, contemporaneous character about them. There is no presumed superiority of 21st century music over, say, the music of the 18th century. In fact, I think the music of the 18th century was a good deal better than the music of the 21st century, but that's a personal judgment. So, and there is no presumptive superiority of 21st century theologians over the theologians of previous centuries, 16th century or the 5th century or whatever. In theology, the discourse itself, the dialogue within theology, has to take place diachronically, as people say, if they like that sort of jargon, over the centuries. So Augustine and Luther and Calvin and Aquinas and people like that are still contemporary participants in theological dialogue. Not because they solved everything, but they have insights that are still relevant, and we need to listen to them and engage with them. I particularly like the writings of the English mystics of the 14th century, people like Mother Julian and so on. If we are to learn from Mother Julian, we have to be content to apprentice ourselves to her insight and her experience, to learn from her. So the character of theology is much more complex in that sort of case. And though there are changes, and though there are certainly new understandings, if people sometimes theology don't make any progress at all, it does make some progress. It only took us 18 centuries to realise that slavery was incompatible with human dignity, for example. So I'd like to see things as far as possible in a developmental way. Not enthralled to the past by any manner of means, but nevertheless not rejecting or feeling that at last the insight about what it's really all about has been given to us. So that's another classification that's possible, a content-oriented classification, deistic, theistic, revisionary, or developmental. And I keep on thinking about these things, and I've just written a book, again available on the bookstall, curiously enough, which is called Theology in the Context of Science. And that's arose in the following way. I recently, 2 or 3 years ago, bought the 3rd edition of David Ford's edited compendium, Modern Theologians. I bought the 1st edition and read that years ago. I thought about time I bought it, and the next edition, book 1, and had a look at that, and I actually read it through from cover to cover. And there are lots of chapters, of course, in it, and some of the chapters are concerned with contextual theologies, like black theology, feminist theology, and liberation theology, and things like that. But when you come to there are a couple of chapters about science and theology in the book. When you come to the discourse changes altogether. It doesn't have this contextual character. It becomes, as almost all the writing throughout, I must confess, most of my own writing in the science and theology area, it becomes atomized, focused on specific problems. I mean, here's Big Bang cosmology, here's evolutionary biology, here's neuroscience, whatever it may be. What do we make of that? Now, of course, that's obviously an important thing to do. I mean, we suppose that those aren't important issues to try to address. But a truly contextual theology, let's take, say, liberation theology. Liberation theology is concerned with particular problems also, economic justice and things of that nature. But it is also concerned with particular experience and the particular intellectual perspective that experience induces. It is concerned not simply with atomized problems, but with style of discourse and sources of inspiration and insight. And I think that we haven't sufficiently presented the science and religion dialogue in that contextual mode. So I've tried to write a book which is anyway a first shot at trying to do that. So the chapter headings in that book aren't things like cosmology, evolutionary biology, and what have you. They're things like discourse, personhood, and so on and so on. And I think there's some mileage in doing that. I mean, it's not a unique way of doing it, but there's some mileage in doing that. And I have to say that I entertain a secret, or really not so secret, as I actually expressed in the book, hope that this way of doing it might prove a little bit more congenial to theologians. Because most of the work, actual work in the dialogue and the interaction between science and theology has come from people whose formation has lain on the scientific side of it. Ian and Arthur and me and lots and lots of other people. Rodney here, for example. Don't necessarily comes to that. We are scientists who bring the insights of our formation into the dialogue. And there aren't too many theologians, in fact there are very few indeed, who seriously engage in the dialogue and who seriously take what the other side try to take what the other side has to say. And I think that's a pity. Now, of course, theologians have a problem, because they're trying to speak about God, who is the ground of everything, and there is a sense in which every insight, human insight into reality, has some relevance to theology. The more you learn about the creation, the more you will learn about the Creator. And theologians can't obviously know everything, but it would be good, I think, if certainly some theological students, I hope some practicing theologians, were to venture into the science and theology of discourse. I mean, all of us who engage in interdisciplinary work this sort know that it's a precarious activity. You have to stick out your neck in order to see a little bit further. So we always have to be prepared to talk about disciplines of which we are not wholly the master, and we have to recognise that. But that's all the more reason for wanting people from the other sides of the dialogue to play their part in in doing it. I once went and gave a lecture in Munich, a seminar in Munich, and after it, Wolfhard Pannenberg, great German theologian, took me out to dinner, tete-a-tete. Now, I've been a little bit critical in print of some of Pannenberg's use of scientific ideas, which I think he sometimes didn't pick up the right end of the stick about. And he was conscious of that, and I was conscious of that. And we had a pretty sticky conversation for a while. And then, in the course of the conversation, I can't remember actually why I said this, but I said to him, of course, I said, I know that I shall never be a professional theologian in the way that I was a professional theoretical physicist. I mean, you just can't serve that long apprenticeship twice in your lifetime. His eyes lit up. He said, that's right, he said. Karl von Weizsäcker, when he chose from physics to philosophy, never realized he hadn't properly become a philosopher. And once I'd established my amateur status with Pannenberg, we got on like a house on fire, actually. We can't all do it on our own. We need the help of friends, and it would be very good if more theologically minded people moved into it. So that's really what I want to say. As you see, there's sort of a whole variety of ways of thinking about the interaction between science and theology. It is a pretty vigorous action, I think, going on at the moment, and it deserves to be. And there isn't a single model for it, or a single way of trying to do it. But it's a very important project to have. I'm a passionate believer myself in the unity of knowledge. I don't want to be a priest and a theologian, so-called, on Sundays, physicist, scientist on Mondays. I want to be both on both days. It's a struggle. It's a struggle for all of us. But it's a tremendously important thing to do. Now, you can help your pupils to be able to see that there is reason for taking seriously both the insights of science and the insights of theology, whether they become believers or not. That seems to me to be a very worthwhile thing to do. So thank you for listening.
Well, that's a wonderful start to our weekend, and we do have some time for questions. So who would like to...
Or comments, I might say.
Yeah, dialogue even. Yeah, comments. Yes.
I wonder, how would you see the difference between development, development and evolution?
Well, evolution is one of these tricky words, because we can use it in various senses. I mean, a lot of the time we're using it in a pretty technical sense to mean the process of the development of life through natural selection, and perhaps by other scientific factors that have been at work. Simon Conway Morris will be talking about conversions and things like that later on this weekend. So in that sense, and that's a particular sort of idea, which is based on a particular scientific paradigm, really, which is that novelty emerges at the edge of chaos, where order and disorder interlace each other and interact with each other. Enough order to be regular but not rigid, enough disorder to be open but not totally haphazard. But evolution also means just, I'm not using evolution in either of those senses, obviously. So development, I simply mean some unfolding process by which insights are identified and discussed and used. So I'm using a pretty generalized sense.
Thank you. Yes. Was there one at the back? Yeah.
I just wanted to
You have to shout over, I'm a bit deaf.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick your brains, really. I teach at a school for children with severe and profound special needs. Closer.
Sorry, yeah.
And
Did you say special needs?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Very severe special needs.
Yeah.
You were talking about the conflict model at the start, and that's a model that you would expect most mainstream pupils to grasp, or even to kind of know already on arrival at school. And my background is in maths and philosophy, and I know in my experience teaching students who haven't got an understanding of number, things like addition and subtraction is far harder than any equations I did at university.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any suggestions for how I could just give them insight into that conflict.
Well, I wish I had. I have a daughter who teaches children with special needs, and I very much admire the work that's done in that area. It does require special skills and discernment. when I next see Isabel, I'll ask her about that. But having lived the privileged life of an academic, I don't. I mean, in any form of teaching, or whatever level it may be, you have to tailor what you say to what people can actually take on board, and that requires expertise and discernment in relation to your particular group of children that I just don't possess. But I wish you very well.
Thank
Sorry,
you
that's not very helpful.
That's okay.
There we are.
Yes, the front here.
John, you seem to dismiss the conflict model sort of fairly readily initially.
Yeah.
Do you think there are some areas, though, where theology and science can never come together, where there can be no genuine dialogue?
Well, that might be. I find it difficult to make very general pronouncements of that sort. It seems to me that it certainly seems to me that the theology has to draw on certain concepts which will not be readily, even in a sort of oblique way, present in the scientific discourse. I mean, I think, for example, understanding salvation, it requires some notion of human solidarity. Certainly physics and biology I don't think encourage that. Maybe anthropology does, and I don't. That's another thing I might say. I think one of the most important but also underexplored parts of the frontier between science and theology is the human sciences side of it, which is one of the reasons I'm very glad my colleague Fraser Watts, who's a Starbridge reader in science and theology here in Cambridge, is a psychologist. But there's a lot of work to do in that sort of area. So there will be certain, and obviously, I mean, in some sense there are clearly, I mean, there's a lot of nitty-gritty science. I mean, I was talking about the deep intelligibility of the world, very general sort of terms. When it comes to try and figure out, some property of energy levels in nuclei, obviously, theology won't really be very much help at all, even in the most generalised and vague sense in that respect. So I think you find that with any discipline, there will be some reasons where there are interesting possibilities of engagement, other reasons where they don't seem to be near enough each other.
Yes, John. We're talking about this threshold between religion and between theology and science from a Christian point of view. How are other religions engaging in this debate, taking into account, say, the Islamic scholars of the 13th century, where that just wasn't an issue?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There was a project in the second half of the 90s, right out of Berkeley, called Science and the Spiritual Quest. And it was an attempt to bring together science and religion in a world ecumenical context. The first phase of it simply involved the Abrahamic phase, and I was involved in that phase. Then there was a second phase with different participants, which in fact drew in, obviously had to do the Eastern religions as well. And the way it was run was that there were 4 groups in the first phase, all with the same science in common. I was in the physics group, of course. 15 people, 5 from each of the 3 Abrahamic faiths. And we sat round a table several times and eventually had a sort of public conference. And of course we had things to say to each other, but it was a fairly, it was an interesting and worthwhile experience, but it didn't get enormously far. And one of the reasons for it was that, in fact, Christians are much more exercised about the science and theology issues than certainly the other Abrahamic faiths. You see, I was involved in founding the International Society of Science and Religion. And our original intention was it should be called the International Society for Science and Theology. And somebody said to us, no, that's no good. Theology is a Christian word. Christians are very concerned with intellectual issues. Jews, for example, are more concerned with halakha, with right conduct, than with lots of theoretical things. And the Islamic story is a complicated story. I did my PhD actually under a very distinguished Pakistani theoretical physicist, Abdus Salam, of course, won a Nobel Prize at the end of the day. And so there's a whole variety of things. And I often think back, when we had founded the International Society, we had our first meeting in Granada. Not only because it's a nice place to be, not only because it's Europe near to Africa, but also because we thought back the later Middle Ages, that period when, broadly speaking, the three Abrahamic faiths interacted quite well with each other. Then the Christians started kicking people out and all fell apart, and we haven't getting back to it. So that's one thing I'd say. I think it is, of course, I think it's very important. I think it's even more important actually that the Eastern religions contribute to this debate, because there are these Californian Buddhists like Capra and so on, who tell us that Buddhism and quantum theory are absolutely stuck with each other. I would like to hear an indigenous adherent of those faiths speaking about those things. And the other thing I want to say is, I said sometime in the course of the evening, I thought that even the suffering was the greatest problem the religion faces. The second greatest problem is, it seems to me, to understand the diversity of the world faith traditions. We can no longer take the view, we know everything, they're strange people in faraway countries. They're down the street, we can see the spiritual authenticity of their lives. Nevertheless, there are these tremendous clashes between the world faith. I mean, what's the human person? Abrahamic faiths say of unique and abiding significance. Our Hindu friends believe it's recycled through reincarnation. Our Buddhist friends, if I understand enough and right, say it's the human self is an illusion for which to seek release. Now, those aren't three sets of people saying the same thing in culturally different languages. That's three people saying different things. There's a very big problem there. And I think it's a problem for the third millennium. It's not going to be settled overnight. There's going to be painful discussion between the world faith traditions. And that discussion has to start with serious issues, but which are not too threatening. You can't start with saying, okay, today it's Jesus, tomorrow it's the Quran, and then we'll work our way through. Everybody's defences just go up when that happens. And there is some value in using science as one of the meeting points, because there are serious things to talk about, but, like I say, not too threatening.
Thank you, John. That's an important question. Yes.
Yeah.
You identify yourself as a realist, or critical realist, and most scientists similarly. You didn't say anything about the anti-realist solution, or would you just put that under the heading of independence?
Well, I did explain why I took a realist position, and because I feel that the way in which nature resists our expectations tells me that I am not making up a pleasing fable for my own intellectual satisfaction, but I am actually encountering a stubborn reality that stands over against me. And I think I mean, I worked in fundamental quantum physics. I was inside a very interesting period, 25 years, led to the discovery of quarks and gluons. All the way along that discovery, we were being driven against, quite often against our expectations, to form this theory. And I just don't believe for a minute that we look at matter in a quite right way, because that's some sort of implicit conspiracy in the invisible college of physicists to look at things in a quite right way. People who allege that have no understanding or experience of how science actually works. So I mean, I can't say much more than that. But I really think I don't think they're going to make up. Of course, I mean, you can say that there is an uncertainty in physics. That the physics changes from time to time. We make maps of the physical world where the scale of the map changes. For example, higher energies we investigated before, then features on the map appear which we haven't thought were there, and modify the picture in some sorts of ways. But again, I see that as developmental and a tightening grasp of actual reality, rather than a whole sequence of fables. I can't say much more than that really, in a short while anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, there's one at the back there.
So I wanted to return back
Stand up.
I wanted to return a little bit back to the issue of the conflict model that you were talking about, and how a lot of that was due to misinterpretation of scripture. You mentioned the creation story as a sort of a false conflict there that comes through a misunderstanding of scripture.
Yeah.
Would you apply the same thing to the resurrection? Because that does seem to me a sort of a real conflict which
Well, I don't think that's just a symbolic story, because I think it does have a real anchorage anchorage in historical motivation. Of course, it's a counterintuitive expectation, and of course, there's not knockdown evidence for it. But I mean, to cycle very, very rapidly over bumpy and extensive terrain. There's something strange about Christ, about Jesus. He dies in midlife, deserted by his followers, painful, shameful death. My God, why have you forsaken me? I believe if the story of Jesus finished there, we probably would never have heard of him. He would be yet another first century messianic pretender who was shown to be deluded. We all heard of that in the self-significance. Something continued with the story of Jesus. There are the appearance stories. Well, they're very varied between the Gospels, to say the least. But they have a common thread that it was difficult to recognize the risen Christ, first of all. Mary thought he was the gardener and so on. That seems to me an unlikely common feature of gaggle of made-up tales. I think it's more likely to be a historical reminiscence. The empty tomb stories, well, there are lots of problems connected with that. But if you were going to make up a story about with important evidential import, you wouldn't choose women to be the witnesses in the ancient world. You wouldn't choose women to be the witnesses. I think they're chosen. They appear in the stories because they actually made the discovery. I think instead they made the discovery they didn't run away when they good old reliable men all ran away. So, you know, I mean, there are things like that. There were arguments at that time which are quite different from interpreting Genesis one literal sort of way, and actually persuade me. And of course, they won't persuade everybody, but they persuade me to take that seriously.
Yeah. Actually, my question might be a bit different question. I have come from Bangladesh. I am Muslim, but I don't live in religion. I am almost atheist. So I found that always conflict between Muslims and Hindu Muslims, Christian Muslim and Buddhist. Why this is happening? What is wrong? It is wrong something in Muslims or in Islam. Muslim is people and Islam is religion. So actually, what's wrong?
Well, what's wrong partly is humanity, I think, and we do tend to fight our corner in that respect, and religious quarrels, when they do blow up, tend to be pretty intense because religion matters to people very much, and all religions, all faith traditions have records of terrible things, of persecutions, of doing bad things to other people. And I think I think that the more we get to know each other, we're still going to have lots of disagreements, obviously, about theological understanding. But at least we can have this mutual respect. I say you can recognize that people of all the different faith traditions a spiritual authenticity in their lives. You can't just say, oh, these are just deluded people in the grip of some terrible error. Any more you can say we're all saying the same thing, different paths up the same mountain, that sort of thing. Lowest common denominator were religion. That doesn't seem to me to work either. So, at the moment, I think that, of course, religious conflicts are very often highly complicated by also being, in some general sense, tribal conflicts. We saw that in Northern Ireland, Protestants and Catholics, and there's an element of that in the relation of the Muslim world to the rest of the world at the moment.
My point, Muslims always think everything is from religious point of view, not from humanitarian point of view. For example, when America was bombing Yugoslavia, they did not protest. But when America bombing Iraq, they are protesting a lot. So what is why they are always thinking from religious point of view, not from humanitarian point of view? And I want to identify a problem where inside the people, inside Muslims people, or inside the religion something is wrong. Actually, I am a teacher of science. I don't know what is religion. That is why I come here to understand.
Well, I think it is very complicated, and there's an intertwining of social, religious, cultural convictions which complicates the issue. I'm not saying anything very very helpful. But there's no sort of two-sentence answer to the important and disturbing question you asked.
Thank you. Yes.
John, I just noticed your original list of interactions.
I see.
Which were conflict, independence, dialogue and integration.
Yeah.
And you related that interaction between science and religion. If I look at my own faith, if I look at my church at the moment as a Christian, and look at the denominations within our church, I would say we've gone through those phases as well. Phases of conflict between the faiths. Phase which we've only just gone through, dialogue. I'm thinking now of Catholics and Protestants, and we're getting to the position of some sort of integration. In fact, there was a position of independence as well, because you can isolate them. And I wonder if the process that we're going through between science and religion may take place between the different religions, because I think, like most of us who are Christians, we believe in a God of all mankind and embracing the whole of mankind and all religions.
Of course, yes.
So perhaps there is hope, not necessarily in our day, but hope of some assimilation and integration in the future.
Well, that may be so. I mean, there's a sense in which the Barber scheme is an almost inevitable logical scheme. You've got A and B. What are the possibilities? Either A or B. A and B, but just alongside each other. A and B with some degree of overlap. I mean, there's not much that slips through that particular net. Now, what you're suggesting is that there may be not only a logical relationship between these things, but there might be a developmental relationship between these. I certainly think that the more we meet and encounter people of different persuasion to ourselves, whether it's in religion or other matters, the more likely we are to respect them and not to demonize them as them, you know. So I hope you're right.
Maybe at least part of the problem, it's not the whole problem because there are genuine differences, but part of the problem is lack of understanding of what the other person's position is.
Absolutely.
And clarification and help and dialogue in all of that is part of the way forward. Yes.
So, to perhaps play devil's advocate, the biggest conflict within this debate at the moment comes almost from within our own camp, with this misinterpretation of Genesis and the refusal to engage with the science, and perhaps our own fear of engaging with them on a level playing field. I'll just put that out there.
Well, it does sadden me that there are people who are undoubtedly genuinely wishing to serve the God of truth. They will refuse at least some truth that is offered to them. I mean, not all truth comes from science, of course, but some of it does. And that's a very sad and quite unnecessary situation. And it's a very puzzling situation to encounter. I mean, it's amazing how different North America is from Europe, for example, in that respect. And I've never fully understood why that should be so. And again, there is a certain tribal element in it. I mean, you know, shibboleths of the tribe are established, and I remember once giving this sort of talk. I was a slightly different sort of talk somewhere in North America, and at the end of it, a young man, a very big young man, came and loomed over me. He said in the most aggressive way, he said to me, "I believe the literal truth, every word of the Bible." He said, every word. So I said to him, "Okay, well in Deuteronomy it repeatedly says that God led Israel out of Egypt with an outstretched arm." How do you interpret that? And of course he wouldn't respond to that. I mean, you know, it was out of bounds.
Yes.
Do you think you can have the good life without God?
Well, I mean, there are clearly people who don't have religious belief, who live lives of truth-seeking, of ethical integrity, and often they are able to attain joy and happiness in the way that religious people often have joy and happiness. I think that ultimately, I think the great mistake in human thinking, it's in fact what original sin really means, is to think that we are autonomous, that the peak of fulfillment of human life is doing it my way. I think actually we are heteronomous. That to be fully fulfilled, we can't do it all on our own. We need the grace and strength of God. I also think that people can receive that enormously, as you might say, and so on. So I think it's a complicated story. But I think in the end of the day, the purpose of creation, as far as humans are concerned, I mean there are other purposes in creation than human ones, but purpose of creation and the fulfillment of creation comes in human beings being led further and further into the life of God. And it is part of religious belief that is a process that is not simply limited to this life. There seems to be no natural expectation of a destiny beyond death. The horizontal story that science tells always ends ultimately in futility. It's the second law of thermodynamics, if you like. Our lives end in death. The universe is going to die on a rather longer time scale than you and me, but eventually there'll be no carbon-based life anywhere in the universe if things go on and say, oh, it'll just be too cold and too dilute. But I believe that the last word doesn't lie with futility and mortality, but lies with God, and that there is a destiny beyond death, because in addition to the horizontal story of science, there is a vertical story of God's faithfulness, and so on and so on. So that's a gift that religious people have, that perhaps non-religious people aren't able to embrace. That means also that some religious people, of course, live lives of sort of stoic fortitude, in the absence of that sort of hope. I mean, a friend of mine in science days, whom I often talked about God, is Steve Weinberg, a very celebrated American physicist and a very staunch atheist. He says in one of his books, talking about cosmic futility, the more I understand the universe, the more it seems to be pointless. And for Steve, there isn't meaning or purpose in the universe at all. There may be a little island of human-induced meaning, but there's a great sea of chaos and meaninglessness, and that's about it. And he greets that with a heroic defiance. And there's a certain ability in that stance, but even though I think it's actually a mistaken stance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
On a bit of a different track,
Yeah.
Listening to you talk just now, I've heard you sort of talking and struggling away with some scientific ideas. Obviously you did when you were in research. And then I've heard you talking and struggling about your theological ideas.
Yep.
How much have you used the same thought processes and the same way of going about it in the two areas?
Well, some similarities and some differences. I mean, in both of them I've suggested that the search for motivated belief is common between the two, and the importance of truthful understanding is common between the two. But the kinds of beliefs are different, and the kinds of ways in which we find beliefs. I've spoke at the beginning about science having the secret weapon experiment, putting things to the test. It's easier to reach intersubjective agreement in
but
science.
Have you not done that with your religion as well? Often
No, I don't.
Had a belief and then it's been challenged, and it's through that challenge.
Well, of course, one's religious belief engages one's experience, but it doesn't engage first of all, in a controlled way.
Right.
I mean, I can't say, okay, if there is a God, let him write a message on the clouds for me tomorrow morning. God doesn't play that sort of silly game, so that it's a different kind of engagement, and because of the impersonal character of science, in principle, even perhaps in practice, if you didn't believe what I told you about a scientific effect, I might be able to take you to a laboratory and show you that effect happening.
Yes.
I can't reproduce for you. You see, all personal experience is unique. It doesn't repeat even for ourselves. Every time we listen to a Beethoven quartet, even if we play the same disc, we have a different experience of it.
But I was just thinking, my physics is not that good, but with the duality of the model of light, the people at that time were suddenly confronted with something that was outside their construction.
Absolutely.
And therefore they had to work through it to get to the, I suppose, yes, you're saying, I do understand.
Yeah, I mean, it took them a long time to work through it too. I mean, the wave nature of light was discovered in the 19th century, at the very beginning of the 20th century with Max Planck, and then later on with Einstein and some other people. The particle nature of light was revealed, and for about 25 years, the physicists had to hold on
That's
by the
what
skin
I
of
was
their
talking
intellectual
about,
teeth
yes.
without knowing how to reconcile the two.
Yes.
In the end, the reconciliation was discovered, actually here in Cambridge by a very brilliant man,
So
my
how
scientific
much-
hero Dirac.
So is that the same feeling as one gets in religion,
Well,
with holding on to something that doesn't fit together?
yes, I think so. I think it's pretty common human experience to do that. Yes, I mean, there is a sort of paradox in religion, just like the paradox I was describing in science. Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. There's a sort of holding on to God. And it's a very well documented feature of the spiritual life, that most people have periods of dryness where God seems very far away, dark night of the soul if you're St. John of the Cross, rather pretentious language for most of us perhaps, so that's there. And you see, going back to the scientists for a minute, they would not have made progress by simply throwing away half of the evidence. I say, let's stick with the waves and forget about the particles. You have to hold on. That's the only way of doing it.
Thank you. We worked John very hard.
It's all very interesting conversation.
Maybe we'll have one last question.
Yeah. Do you have hope for the Hadron Collider?
Sorry?
Do you have hope for the Hadron Collider?
Large Hadron Collider, John.
Oh, yeah, AC. Oh, well, yeah, yes. I mean, it'll get patched up. I mean, it's a highly embarrassing incident.
But do you think when it is, that it'll reveal truth that...
Well, it'll explore in a very, very careful and detailed way a region of energy that we've hardly had access to before. The present highest energy machine in the States is at Fermilab, as the highest machine in the world, and it just begins to touch the region where the Higgs boson might be found. The LHC will take you 7 times beyond that energy, and will be much more detailed in its investigations. At the moment, the people of the LHC are terribly worried because the Fermilab people in the States have seen little indications that might be the Higgs being there, but they're not yet statistically significant. They need more and more events. And they're working like mad, of course, to get those events before the LHC switches on, which will probably be in the autumn. So, but one way or another, if the Higgs is there, it will be found. And think about poor Peter Higgs. He's a friend of mine, more as a contemporary of mine. He had this wonderful idea about 40 years ago, and he's been sitting there in Edinburgh since then. If it's verified that there is a Higgs boson during Peter's lifetime, he will undoubtedly get a Nobel Prize or a share in the Nobel Prize. If he's died before it's found, or it's not found, he won't. He can't get the posthumously. So yes, he's the think of the poor old theorists at the hands of the experimentalists. But the thing that's worrying about the LHC is this: these very high energy collisions are fantastically complex. They occur at an enormously high rate, and a great spray of debris comes off each time. And so the data is immensely complex. And the way you look for significant discoveries, you can't look at every straw in the haystack to find the needle. So they have computerized search programs to look for particular configurations of debris coming off, which are signals of what you're looking for. And if the Higgs is there and has the properties we expect, they will, and it has the mass in the mass range, which is pretty likely, they will find it. But usually when you go into a new regime of energy, the most interesting things you discover are the things you didn't know beforehand. And some of those may very well get lost at CERN, just in the debris. It's a real problem. I mean, there's just too much going on. But it's worth every penny.
Yes, drop in the ocean with the trillions of the banks and the world financial system. That's tremendous. I think we'd better draw to a close. We've really worked John very, very hard, and I think this has been a great start. So thank you very, very much indeed.